Hey there everybody, in this video we're going to review a bike so bright and blingy you've got to wear shades, and when you ride it, animals will just come out of the forest to admire it. That's right, we're going to take a look at the Otso Warakin in stainless steel. Find out what I like and dislike about it in this video. Welcome back, Pathless Peddlers, and if you're new to the channel, if you're into the non-competitive side of cycling, gravel, exploring, bike touring, the supple life, you have found your people. And this bike review, like all the other bike reviews that we do on the channel, we do not get paid for. We do not get paid to quote unquote present the bike. They send the bike, I ride it, I review it, share with you guys my honest opinions, then I ship the bike back. And if you appreciate that and want to support it in this crazy time when there's so many sponsored posts left and right, you don't know what the actual truth is, consider supporting the channel via the PayPal and Patreon links or by buying a patch. Okay, so this is the Warakin by Otso. Kind of hard to miss. It is a very shiny bike. And if you're not familiar with Otso, they're actually the bike brand of Wolf Tooth components. So Wolf Tooth is known for making really clever solutions to bike problems and tools. And this is their bike. So let's get the numbers out of the way. You can purchase the bike as a frame set, frame and fork for $1,500, or you can get the frame without the fork for about $1,200. And you can also buy a complete bike. Complete bikes range anywhere from $2,500 to sky's the limit. This particular build I reviewed retails for around $2,800. On the scales in a rideable setup, that includes these kind of pretty basic SPDs and a bottle cage. It weighed in at about 23.6 pounds. So not the lightest bike ever, but definitely a bit lighter than your typical Surly steel bike. In terms of the build, this bike came equipped with 650B. It's using the Head Ardennes Plus wheel set. It originally shipped with some Terrain Elwoods, which were a little bit too slick for the conditions these days. So I did swap them out for the Sendero, which has a little bit more grip and bite in dusty and dry conditions. This build has 105 drifters. It is set up 1x with a 42 tooth chain ring in the front, and it's connected to an Ultegra RX rear derailleur with a Wolf Tooth link so it can clear a big cassette. The fork is a carbon lithic fork. It's their homebrew brand. The carbon fork has a lot of nice clearance for wide tires. As you can see, plenty of room here, and it does have eyelets you can run a fender. Both wheels are through axle, front and rear, and disc brakes. This build uses a pretty utilitarian Tektro cable actuated disc brake. You'll notice that there are lots of nice little gold accents, everything from the spacers up front to the headset to all the little bolts around the bike. And this is something you can actually specify, which I guess is a huge advantage when you also make little components and knickknacks. As I mentioned earlier, and if it's not obvious, the frame itself is this stainless steel. It does have some slight etching with the Otso logo, little part where it says Warakin, cute little bear. And I have to say, it is one nice looking frame in person. It almost has that Thai look without the Thai price. And for the most part, I think the welds are pretty nice and clean. I mean, it's pretty bold to come out with a bare metal frame, and I think they really pulled it off nicely with this bike. On the rear of the bike, there are more eyelets to attach both a rack and a fender. So pretty good utility in the rear, not so much in the front. The fork is fairly plain. You can't attach a lowrider mount or a 3-pack mount or a front rack or anything like that, which is kind of a bummer. But it is what it is. I think one of the really unique things about the gravel bikes from Otso is the what they're calling the tuning chip in the rear of the bike. This allows you to change the chainstay length, the rear center, from 420 to 440. They offer options of this flippable chip as well as one which is dialed right in the middle. To do this, you have to undo some retaining bolts, flip the chip. It is kind of two fixed positions. It's not a sliding kind of slot, and then re-secure the bolt, and it locks it in there so it's not going to slip or there's no play. On the brake side, you do something similar. You undo the bolt, flip the chip. On there is a slot to move the caliper backwards and forward, and then you tighten the whole thing together. I found it pretty easy to do in a bike stand. Definitely not something that you would do on a whim while actually riding. So it's one of those things where you kind of figure out which position you like, and then you kind of set it there, or you figure out how you want the bike to ride for the day, adjust it, and then ride it all day in that setting. So the change isn't quick, but it is fairly simple if you have the right tools and are just patient. So that's it for the specs and the components. How does the bike ride? So I've spent a fair amount of time on the bike, taking it out on day rides with lots of good climbing and rocky descending. And I've ridden it in two modes. its most tuck position, which would be 420, and its most rearward position, which would be 440. So I'm going to talk about the untucked position first because that's how the bike was shipped to me. So set in the 440 position, the bike rode fairly balanced. I would say the front end of the bike was fairly responsive. A little bit more quicker to steer than something like the Salsa Warbird or even the Kona Rove. Not as twitchy or road-like as the War Road or the Midnight Special. In terms of the rear of the bike, the main adjective that came to my head was smooth. But despite its smoothness and despite the longer setting, I found that the bike actually accelerated pretty well. Looking at the geometry numbers and comparing it with how it felt, the numbers don't really belie how the bike rides. I think even in the longest setting, it does not ride like a touring bike. It definitely has a little bit more get up and go, and it's just a pleasure to ride. Probably not the quickest bike off the block, but definitely quicker than other gravel bikes out there that I've tested. A little bit more get up and go than the Kona Rove, even though it's got longer chainstay numbers. So I don't know how that happens, whether it's just the beefier tubing in the rear, but in its longest setting, it's still pretty responsive. I also rode the bike a fair amount in its shortest settings. Again, this moves the chainstay to 420. It also alters the front end geometry a bit. I'm not quite sure the exact specifications. I will say that the bike setup this way is not going to be to everyone's liking, especially if you ride them back to back. I found the front end really fun. It was really spicy, definitely had that feeling of the rear wheel sitting beneath you, and when you would stand and accelerate, it just kind of had that nice kind of jumpiness if you're into that. But by moving the rear end forward and possibly adjusting the head angle in the process, the front end got a little strange. It felt less balanced than in the previous setting. The front end felt a little bit too slack in its handling. I had a tendency when I first hopped on the bike to kind of understeer it and miss the corners, so it definitely took a bit of adjustment. It is something that you would adapt to given enough time, but riding it back to back, it's pretty interesting. The former position definitely feels more balanced to me, and this more tuck position, definitely fun in the rear, takes some adjustment in the front. What I've learned from this is that by flipping the chip, you don't get two different bikes. It's not like you get, for the sake of reference, just because I know the Salsa family really well, by flipping the chip, you do not get a Warbird and a War Road in the process. What you do get is a nicely balanced bike on one end, and one where it's a little bit more of an acquired taste, let's say. Not to say that it's not fun. I definitely had a blast riding it in the tuck position. I loved how it climbed. Descending with the bike and taking turns and taking corners did take some adjustment, but it was still a fun ride, just different, but it didn't feel like a War Road. So what did I like and dislike about the bike? I think what surprised me is that even in its longest position, it still felt pretty quick. I would definitely classify this bike as more, I hate to use the word, but performance oriented. It definitely feels racier than something like the current crop of Warbird or even the Kona Rove. I think it would be great for gravel events, short spirited rides. You could take it bike packing if we went all rackless in the front. A good looking bike. In terms of what I didn't like about the bike, I thought I would enjoy flipping the chip more, but I felt like in the shortest setting, the bike handling was a little bit more disjointed than in the longer setting. So I think if I were to keep this bike personally, I would probably keep it just in the longest setting, or maybe experiment with the middle setting, which I didn't get a chance to do for the sake of this review. Another thing I was kind of bummed about was the lack of any utility in the front. Yes, it'll take fenders, but it would have been nice if it had a 3-pack mount, low rider rack, all the good stuff that I like in a true all-rounder. I will also say, for me, the front end of the bike was a little bit on the stiff side. It really relies heavily on the tires for that suspension. Again, if I were to keep it, I would probably definitely swap out the stem for a redshift stem, get a little bit more suppleness, a little bit more rough stuff comfort in the front. Overall, the frame itself felt smooth, maybe a touch on the stiffer side of things. I would say stiffer, racier, more performance-oriented spectrum of bike. So overall, a pretty fun bike to ride. Definitely leaning more towards a performance-oriented end of things. Had a blast in both positions. I think it was definitely more balanced in the longer position. What do you guys think of the bike? Let me know in the comments below. And if you guys have any other questions, leave those in the comments. I'll be sure to answer them. And if you guys appreciate these reviews, consider supporting the channel. And as always, keep the supple side down.